Hello. Today we are going to go through and use Eclipse to actually write some code using loops and explore nested loops a little bit as well. So I'm going to start out with a brand new file, a brand new class, and I went ahead and named mine loops practice. Remember, always make sure that you put your comment block at the top. And we will be getting input from the user, so you're going to need to import java.util.scanner. When working with loops, it's always very important that you label your ending curly braces, because with loops, you're going to really start using curly braces a lot more often, and being able to make sure that you know which curly brace matches up with which, so you know what code is being executed within which loop is very important. So I'm going to start out with just some simple for loops. So we talked about it in the last video. For loop starts out with the word for. Then it has 3 sections. So the first section is where I'm going to declare my variable if I don't already have a variable that I'm going to use. The second section is where I'm going to put my condition. And then the third section is where I'm going to increment or decrement or change my looping variable. So I've created a variable a, started it out at 0. I want to continue as long as a is less than 5. And I want to go up by 1 each time that the loop executes. And I'm just going to output the value a, and then I want to determine what its squared value is. So I'm going to say a squared is plus, and then I always like to put any math that I'm doing inside of extra set of parentheses there, and a semicolon. So a very simple loop. It's going to run through while a is less than or equal to, or less than 5. I can save it real quick and run it. I'm taking a look at my console down here. 0 squared is 0, 1 squared is 1, 2 squared is 4, 3 squared is 9, 4 squared is 16. And so the first value you see here, the 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, is just the value of a. And so if we're looking at this loop is going to iterate 5 times. So it goes from 0 to 4, which gives me 5 iterations of the loop where it's just outputting those simple values. Now it's easy to go through and kind of change these loops. So let's say that I wanted to reverse it. And I want to say b equals 4, because that was the last value that was printed. As long as b is greater than or equal to 0, and then b is going to decrease each time. I can take a shortcut and copy and paste and just change these to b's, because notice that a is telling me right here, if I look at this error, a does not exist, cannot be resolved to a variable, means it does not exist, because remember that this variable, because it was created inside of the for loop, only lives for the life of the for loop. So once this loop has exited, a no longer exists. So I have to make sure that I use the correct variable. And oftentimes you may have a loop that you might use over and over again, or you're just going to kind of edit a little bit as you're going through it. Make sure that you're very careful and change your variable names as you're going through things. It's a very common mistake that you'll see made at times. And so here's my original outputs. Here's my second set of outputs. I could put in a empty line here to make it a little bit easier to see what is going on. So here's the first set of my outputs, and then here's those outputs backwards. And it's very simple to go through. Let's say I want to make this 50, but I want to go up by 5 each time. I can do something like a plus equals 5. Or let's say I want to start this at 49, and I want to go down, divide that value by 2 each time. You can put any type of changing value inside of this third section that you want as you're going through it. What you have to be careful of is something like this. And you're going to notice right here, it just seems it's still going and going and going. You want to make sure that you stop your program if you realize that it's in an infinite loop. And you can tell it's an infinite loop because look at how many times I have that outputted, and I can go all the way up to the top and I don't see my actual value. And the reason being, you say, look at, it says 0 squared is 0. Well, as long as b is greater than or equal to 0, when you're doing division, sometimes you kind of lose precision of things. So it might be better to go while b is greater than negative 1. Well, think about that. Wait a minute. Now 0 is greater than negative 1, so that won't work. So troubleshooting loops is something that takes a little bit of time. You kind of have to think through. You might realize that, well, worst comes to worst. Let me try it and see what happens. Well, you get the same thing. Well, I know 0 squared is 0, so maybe as long as it's greater than or equal to 1, I'm going to go through and run it. And here I get 49 squared, I get all the way down to 1 is 1, and it exits this time. And I can look up here. Here I increased by 5 each time and did my squared values, and here I was decreasing. I divided it in half. 49 divided by 2 is 24, divided by 2 is 12, and so on. And get my values. So just some easy, simple work with for loops. Maybe I want the user to enter a number, and that's going to dictate what I do inside of my loop. So I'm going to ask them to enter a whole number. And now that we've done loops, you might very well go through and say, I want to make sure that I have smart input. I want a whole number, and really I want a whole number that's going to be greater than 0. So to do some error checking there, I can create my value and say that it's the user's value. And first I'm going to need to create a scanner to represent my keyboard. So I'm going to say user equals in.nextInt. I always do an in.nextLine after it to get rid of the extra input. So they enter a number that's greater than 0, and while user is less than or equal to 0, then they're being stupid or silly, and I need to ask them again. So I can just copy and paste that code and maybe emphasize that I need the value that's greater than 0. And make sure when you do that, I don't want to recreate user. I want to use that same variable as I go through this. So to check and make sure that this works, I can just print out something like your value was, and print out the user's value. So I can see that it's working correctly as I go through it. So there's my original for loops. Please enter a whole number greater than 0. So if I enter negative 1, it tells me to enter it again. What you want to be careful of is if I try to enter in a decimal value, I'm going to get an error. And the reason that I get an error is that the input doesn't match. This is a decimal value, and I'm trying to store it inside of a whole number, inside of an int, and that won't work. So there's always some error checking that you might have to work around a little bit, but hopefully they're going to enter just a whole number. And some of you might say, well, I don't want to have to keep scrolling down and see this stuff outputted each time. There's a very quick and easy way in Eclipse. I can highlight something and go up here to source, and I can say toggle comment. And that just is going to comment out those lines, and if I wanted to undo that, I can come back up here and say toggle comment again. So it just kind of turns it commenting on or turns commenting off. So I'm going to turn it on so I can focus kind of on what's really what I'm testing right now. I know that these two for loops work. They do exactly what I want them to do. I really just want to work on testing. If I enter in a whole number, does it work? And it did. And even if I ran it and say I entered in bad value and then a good value. I get my number. Could you do this with a do-while loop? Sure. On the AP exam, you're not expected to know do-while loops. So really kind of for the purpose of the class, I would expect to see you do it in a while loop. Will I take off points if you do it with a do-while loop? Nope. Definitely not. But the while loop is kind of the basic of what you need to know. And if you want to get into do-while loops, you can. So now I have a value from my user. And let's say that I want to use that inside of my for loop. So I say for, well, I already have a value, and I want to go as long as that user value is greater than 0, and user is going to go down by 10 each time. And I just want to print out those numbers, so kind of count down from my value by 10s and see what I get. I save this, I can run it, I enter in a number. So it starts out at 123, so we get 123, 113, 103, and so on and so forth all the way down to 3. The next value that it would be negative 3, which is no longer greater than 0, so it did not get printed out. So one thing you can do to kind of check and make sure that it's working too is I now have that variable that I can use before and after, and I can really see kind of what's happening with those variables. Because user was created outside of the loop, I can use it both inside of the loop and outside of the loop. If I enter in a smaller number, 89, goes all the way down. When done, user was negative 1, because 9 minus 10 is going to give me negative 1. You want to remember that when you're doing this, if you're leaving out that beginning section, that you do always have to put that semicolon there. The condition has to appear between a set of semicolons. And like I said in the last video, sometimes you might want to leave out that third section because it's going to change based on what's happening. And anytime that you create a new loop with curly braces, it's good to label that that is the end of that specific loop. So you know that anything inside of these is going to be associated with this for loop. So what I want to say is if user, that number is even, then I'm going to increase it by multiplying it by 2. And if the value is odd, then I'm just going to add 1 to it. And I'll go ahead and print out what user's value is as I'm going through it, just so you can kind of see where it starts and where it ends. So if I go ahead and start with a value, oh, we got a problem. We got an infinite loop here. I went through with 89, and it's hard sometimes because you might not be sure exactly where that infinite loop is. So debugging code is a little difficult. That's why you always want to try and test as you go along. I know that this code up here worked, so I know it doesn't have anything to do with that. I've tested this for users greater than 0, user subtracted by 10. Here I went through, and if user was less than 100, I said if user is even, multiply it by 2. Well, I have a problem. If the value was 0 at the end of this loop, what's 0 times 2? It's going to be 0. So you always want to check your most specific cases first when you're doing your if statements, if you remember. So let's say if the user value is 0, then I'm going to add 1. Otherwise, if it's even, I'm going to multiply it by 2, and if it's odd, then I will add 1 to it also. Let's try that again. You can see that my value was 89. It went through down to 9. When it was done, the user value was -1, which caused some kind of error when I was going through this, because it was -1, so it would have been considered an odd number, so it added 1 to it. Well, when it became 0, 0 divided by 2, there's going to be nothing left over. 0 times 2 is 0. So you want to be very careful as you're going through code to always kind of go through and trace and break down each section as you're going through it. So now when I go through it, you see that I get, when it was 0, I add 1 to it. When it's odd, I added 1 to it, became 2, and then from there on out, I just multiplied by 2, and then once, as long as it was less than 100. Now you're probably saying, well, why did it print out 128 if the value was supposed to stop at less than 100? And this is something else to be careful of. I changed user before I printed it. So 128 was the value that made this condition false. Very often, sometimes you'll see where they'll take this line of code and they might move it and do it at the beginning before you change the value. Entering 89 again, I get a different answer. Notice that I get -1 printed out, then 0, then 1, then 2, and then all the way up to 64, and I don't get that 128. So placement of one line of code, just from changing it from being at the beginning of a loop to the end of the loop, or from the end of the loop to the beginning of the loop, can make a big impact on what happens with your program. Now we're going to take another look at while loops. Remember that I said that anything that you can do with a for loop, you can do with a while loop. So we're just going to take those two loops that we did at the beginning, and I'm going to paste them down here. So that you can see exactly which loop becomes what when I change it into a while loop. So if I was doing this again, remember that with all of our loops, you're going to identify those three sections. So the first section is always, what is your loop variable? Second section is, how is your loop variable changing? So right now I'm going to continue while a is less than 50. And then because this loop is going up by 5, I'm going to have to make this loop use curly braces, because there's going to have to be two different things that go on there. One thing that's going to go on is that I'm going to output my value, and then I also need to make sure that I am changing my loop variable as I go through it. So this is the end of a is less than 50 loop. So if I go through, here's creation of the variable, here's then my condition, here's the next other condition, and here is changing of the loop variable with the same purpose of my loop right there. And this now iterates 50 times from 0 to 49. And then taking a look, go ahead and uncomment that so I get some space in between it. Here's my second for loop that I can go through and create. B is going to start at 49, while B is greater than or equal to 1. Again, because I'm doing something that's not just increasing by 1 or decreasing by 1, I'm changing by 2 each time, I'm going to have to use curly braces with this while loop. So this is the end of my B greater than or equal to 1 loop, and I want to output that value, B equals B divided by 2, and I've got my three parts again. 0 to 45. I'm squaring each value, and here I'm getting my 49 down to 1 because I'm dividing by 2 each time. So anything you can do with a for loop, you can do with a while loop. Anything you can do with a while loop, you can do with a for loop. You may have to think about it a little bit more just to kind of figure out how to twist those things around. And again, some things to be careful of with all of these loops. You never, never, never want to put a semicolon right there. What happens if you put a semicolon right there at the end of a for loop? You're going to see that that loop is always going to run one time. So here it says my value was 8 to begin with. It goes down by 10. It runs one time. I should probably use a better example. Here's 89. Oops. So my value is 89. And it says for user equals for users greater than 0, user down by 10, print out user. Well, it didn't print out all the values, it just prints out that -1. This loop actually still runs. It's going to still change user. It's just that nothing is going to happen each time that loop runs. It's not going to print this value each time the loop runs. You're going to just get this statement always printing one time. So you want to make sure no semicolons there. Same thing with while loops. No semicolons here. If I put a semicolon right there, you're going to see it goes through my values while a is less than 50, and you're like, okay, well it's not doing anything. Why isn't it? Nothing's happening. Look over here and notice that your program is actually still running. And the reason being a is 0. 0 is less than 50. This one's going to become an infinite loop because a is never going to change now, so a will always be less than 50, but it's doing nothing every time the loop runs because of the semicolon. So be very careful looking for semicolons that you accidentally place at the end of a for loop or at the end of a while loop as you're going through them. So something to definitely be careful of. The last thing that I want to show you coded examples of is what's called a nested loop. And we looked at nested if statements as we went through them, where you have conditions inside of conditions. But nested loops get a little bit more complicated because you're going to end up doing things multiple times based on an initial value. So if we take a look at what's actually happening with a nested loop. Let's say that I have nested for loops. Let me make them really easy. And I'm going to say my row equals 0, while row is less than 5. I want row to go up by 1 each time the loop runs. And I have a curly brace, and I'm going to say that I have another variable called call, while call is less than 3. Call plus plus system.out.print and x, the space, just to kind of see it spaced out a little bit. And then when that's done, I want to print out a new line. And this is the end of my for row less than 5 loop. So if you take a look at this, what you want to look at first is kind of identify what's happening. So if you take a look, this outer loop here, that loop is going to run when row is zero, 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's going to iterate. Outer loop will iterate 5 times. It's going to run 5 times. Well, what does it do each of those 5 times? As we're going through it, let's take a look at my inner loop. The call loop will run when call is 0, 1, 2, and that's it. So the inner loop will iterate 3 times. But this inner loop runs every time the outer loop runs. So this inner loop, this loop right here, is going to go 0, 1, 2, but it's going to do that every time that this loop runs. So if we take a look at this, and it is a little confusing, we're going to start, let's look first at just what happens with my inner loop. So let's say I have my inner loop, super easy. I just get 3 little x's. And I'm going to go ahead and comment out all of this stuff so you can kind of see what's happening rhythmically. So with that inner loop right here, I just get 3 x's, which is what we said was going to happen. That inner loop call is going to run 0, 1, 2. And what does it do each time? It just prints out an x. But when I go and I add in that outer loop, so I add in here, I'm going to go ahead and highlight in a quick, easy way. If you're going to do something, it's just highlight both lines and hit tab. And then I've got system.out.print line. Just to give me an empty line at the end of that. My ending curly brace for my row less than 5 loop. So I save it, I run it. The outer loop ran 5 times, the inner loop ran 3 times, and I get kind of a 2-dimensional shape. Nice little easy square. And you can really have a lot of fun with nested loops. You just have to be very careful. If I take that same nested loop and I say while call is 0 and while call is less than row, what am I going to get? So now the number of times that this inner loop runs is going to change each time. And just so I can kind of see. I'm going to print out that row value so you can see kind of what's happening as I go through it. So for row 0, I got no x's. Because call starts at 0, is 0 less than 0? No. This loop never runs the first time. As soon as row becomes 1, call starts at 0, 0 is less than 1, I get 1x. Next time through, row is 2, 0, call starts over again at 0, and I go 0 less than 2, so I should get 2 x's. And so you can kind of start creating different shapes as we're going through them. And you can nest with for loops or while loops, and we'll see a few examples of both of them. It's something that you want to definitely make sure that if you're going through and trying to figure out what code does, that you write down your variables and trace through it as you're going through it. And kind of an easy way to do that and to see what is actually happening is instead of printing x there, let's say that I print the call value. So you're really going to see exactly what's happening with the variables. So these values here before the semicolon were my row values, and the values after the semicolon, after the colon, are my column values. So that's some code to go through and look at loops. Make sure that you have this working and running. These are some good examples that you may need to use later on in this class. Good luck.